Okay, so let's get started today on, we're going to go over some brief sets of information for those of you who do produce APIs. We're trying to go over in the trainings, we have consumer training, we go over the stuff you need to know for being a consumer in WSO2. Today we're going to go over specifically the stuff you want to know if you're a producer of an API in WSO2. There's just a totally different subset of things you have to worry about and concern yourself with than you do if you're consuming. So first of all, if you don't know, SOA is retiring on April 30th. Gasp. I know, shocking. Probably the first you're hearing of it. Oh, good. Anyways, it's going to be retired April 30th. We're all shooting for that date. I want to get you there as quick as we can. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for you. Specifically, what's going away for this April 30th date. We have a hard time sometimes actually getting the full picture of what SOA is and is not involved in. So the boxes that run SOASoft are going to go away. So any call that is actually physically passing through those boxes will cease to function. The backends will continue to work. They'll be moved to WSO2, things like that, but those boxes will cease to respond. Along with that, in SOASoft, we utilized API key nonce authentication and basic auth. Those were really the two authentication mechanisms we always used, and you could use those to call all of the APIs involved in SOASoft. Those authentication mechanisms are both going away. Neither of those are available for you to use to call an API anymore with WSO2. So that's really some of the big stuff. As far as you as consumers or producers are concerned, you don't really have to care about the authentication unless you're also consuming something. So the biggest thing is just migrating your authorizations. So what is actually different for you as a producer between WSO2 and SOASoft? In SOA, almost all of our authorization on the back end was focused around what we refer to as the C framework headers inside of OIT. Principal ID, actor, SM user, all of those headers were received by your backend to be able to identify who was calling your service, whether it was an application, whether it was a user or an application acting for a user. You were able to identify all of those pieces of information via those headers, and then made authorization decisions based on that. In WSO2, we've put all of that information and a ton more information into something that's called a JWT, or a JSON Web Token. Pronounced JOT per the spec, pronounced JWAT by yours truly. I think my pronunciation's better. And then OAuth 2 is what the consumers will see on the front end. They're not going to see basic auth and API key nonce authentication anymore. They'll see OAuth authentication. We won't really go over that in depth today because as a producer, you don't have to worry about that unless you're consuming. But we are going to go specifically over the JWAT, what that entails, how you actually get information out of that, so you know who's calling your service and how you can make authorization decisions. Also, as we go through this, I want it to be an interactive thing. So if you have questions, raise your hand, ask in the moment. Don't wait for me to get to the end of an hour-long spiel and then forget your question. So specifically, let's go over what the JSON Web Token is. It is an open standard. It's part of an internet-wide standard. I don't remember the RFC number, but you can look it up, which is a huge benefit for us. For a long time in OIT and in BYU in general, we've followed kind of our own homebrewed practices. Our API key nonce authentication was homebrewed. Our C framework headers were homebrewed. We didn't really follow any kind of standard. You had to know the way we had done things. There weren't really a lot of libraries that you could utilize unless we'd written one. Because we're moving to the JSON Web Token, which is a standard, there's tons of work that's been done all across the world. Hundreds of libraries for all sorts of different languages, Stack Overflow questions, all of that is available at your fingertips to be able to figure out what you need to do, get help. You're not just reliant on BYU to help you. There's also just tons of resources out there and available to you, making it way easier. Another awesome thing about the JWAT that we didn't previously have with SOASoft is that it is secure. One of the downsides of our SOASoft infrastructure with those C-framework headers was that we had no way to prove that the header had actually been set by SOASoft. A lot of what we did to control our applications was tied down to IP address ranges. We only responded to certain IP addresses, which were the SOASoft boxes and the reverse proxies. That was really the only mechanism we had to protect ourselves from getting calls from other places. With the JWAT, it is cryptographically signed via the WSO2 private key, which allows you on your side and the producer side to actually verify that signature using our public key to validate that all of the information in the JWAT is the way WSO2 sent it to you. It prevents a whole ton of attacks that we can get. It prevents man in the middle, it prevents that data being tampered with in transit, and it prevents people from just falsifying the JWATs altogether. All of those things make an invalid signature and make it so that you can't properly validate that JWAT. Another beautiful thing about the JWAT is that we're able to transmit an arbitrary amount of data with it. Our JWAT is rather large currently, but we're free to kind of shove whatever kind of information we need in there, take information out that we don't need. Makes it really, really flexible for us going forward to be able to make sure we're sending across all the information that you could possibly need for you as a publisher. And that's what we're trying to, that is our goal with our current JWAT, is to make it so that you have all of the information you could possibly need to make an authorization decision handed right to you without you having to go out and find out more information. And because it is actually, the reason it's called JSON Web Token is because it parses out to just a JSON object. So it's super easy to parse and use. I don't know of a language that can't handle JSON, at least through a library, if not natively. It makes it really, really easy to handle. So let's go over what a JWAT actually looks like. It looks like this nastiness, but this is not the useful piece. The JWAT is handed to you base64 encoded. We've had miscommunication in the past, some people thinking it was encrypted. It's not, it's just base64 encoded. There are a couple of dot separators you'll see in there. Probably should circle them. The very top line, almost to the end, you'll see a period right before the EYJ. That is the first dot separator. There's a second one somewhere in there if you want to play Where's Waldo. But this is the idea behind it, is essentially there's a header object and then dot separated into the payload and dot separator for the signature. So all of those, if you just rip apart that whole base64 encoded at the periods, you get a base64 encoded JSON object for the header and for the payload and for the signature. It's all just super easy to grab. So let's actually dig into that and see what you're actually going to be seeing. We're only going to focus on the payload. You don't need to super concern yourself with the header and the signature quite yet. We'll kind of go over how that plays in later. This is what one of the possible JWATs you could get looks like. We'll go over, there's 4 different possible combinations of things you can get in a JWAT. So this specific JWAT is only including client information. You can see on the right-hand side, the claim user type is set to application, and the client claim source is set to client subscriber. We'll kind of go over those. Application means that this is just a client. For those of you who do speak OAuth, who do know how the consumers interact, that means that this was done through client credentials OAuth flow. That's the only flow that produces this kind of JWAT, which means that there is no user sitting at the keyboard that we're identifying. We're only identifying the application that's calling you. As you can see, we get a lot of claims in here. Part of the JSON Web Token standard is that claims be properly scoped. And the scope is a URL, essentially. And so you'll see that WSO2 has quite a few claims that they've put in by default. Some things like you're able to see the key type. You know whether they're trying to call for production or sandbox. If you want to handle your production and sandbox environments in one set of code instead of 2 separate deployable code pieces, you can. You can have the same set of code connected to 2 separate databases and just say, oh, they asked for Sandbox, I'll use the Sandbox database, or oh, they asked for Pod, I'll use the Pod database. That makes it really easy for however you want to handle that. You see that user type, you see what tier they have, see what API they call, the context, the application name, all of that. Now, some of that is very WSO2 specific. Things like the application ID, we don't really use at all in our BYU infrastructure. Happens to be application 1, woohoo, we'll never use that as an identifier. But we do use at times the client ID to identify things. Then on top of that, we've shoved a whole ton of our BYU information into here. So we'll give you the net ID of the subscriber, the net ID of the person who actually created the application. Now, this is where this claim source comes into play. In WSO2, when you create an application, by default, we associate that application to your own personal identity. We have a workflow set up where you can attach your application to a non-person person, what we've called it in BYU in the past, or an organizational identity. But if you don't go through that process, the application identifies as you by default. That makes it really easy for you to test things because you have your own permissions already. If we automatically attached you to a new non-person person, there would be very few APIs you could actually call because you wouldn't have any self-service rights, which is why we do that today. So if you get this client subscriber in the claim source, that means that client information is just the person who created it. It's just the creator's information. It's not been associated to any other identification. So if for some reason your backend authorizes based on that information or needs to know, it's there available to you. Then we give you the person ID, BYU ID, net ID, surname, rest of name, all of those identifiers and information that we're used to in our BYU infrastructure, all those ways of looking at the information for the user. Now, in this same flow, if the user had attached their application to a non-person person or an organizational identity, what changes is this claim source changes to client ID. From client subscriber to client ID. It signals to you on the back end again, if you care. There's probably in most cases you won't actually care if it's a non-person person or if it's the creator, you just use the identity anyways. But if you do care, that is the check that allows you to say, oh, this was attached to a non-person person. And then you get all the same information again. Person ID, BYU ID, net ID, all of the names in all of the ways. Josh.
Does the subscriber go away or is it still there?
The subscriber is still there. So we actually will always pass you the subscriber net ID. So even if Chad creates an application, associates it to like a library non-person person, you will always see Chad's net ID as the initial creator there. Again, if for some reason your backend cares, it's a very marginal amount of APIs that will ever care about that, if you have any. But we wanted to make sure that was provided for you. Again, we're trying to make sure you have all the information you could possibly need. And so essentially we give you all the information that we know at the time of the JWAD generation. So that you just have everything we could possibly give you. Now, Chad.
So the person ID, BYU ID, net ID, those would be the organizations.
Exactly. So as soon as this switches to client ID, and as soon as you've attached your application to a non-person person, all of this information is filled out with that person's information instead.
So how do we attach a non-person person to an application?
So currently today, for our migration, we kind of wanted to make it as easy as possible on you and make the identity team not like me very much. And so currently the workflow is if you contact the identity team directly, Belinda, Dan, Denise, all of them, they'll help you attach that. They have the way to handle that. Going forward, in fact, that's what I was working on today. Going forward, what we're going to start doing is automatically generating new non-person persons for you as you generate applications. We're moving into a world of we want every application to have its own identity. In the past, we've had a lot of like inside of OIT, we've attached all of our applications to our services. We're moving into a world where we want every application to self-identify and have its own permissions. So once we're past this migration, we're not going to affect the migration workflow. Then we will move to every time you generate an application, we'll automatically send you a new non-person person for it. And so you'll probably never see client subscriber ever again after we make that change. The only case being, we'll leave your default application as client subscriber so you can test with your own personal rights. But any other application will be given a new identity and you'll be able to go through and request rights for that via InfoHub and all of that. So we make that process easier on you and you don't have to go in and say, I need a new identity or I need it attached. We're trying to make that as streamlined as possible. Did that answer your question, Chad? I know we diverged, but yes.
That's nice because it will allow the consuming developer to go in and say, okay, I'm not going to answer because my application doesn't have rights, or because I don't have rights, or because my user doesn't have rights.
Exactly.
And have some flexibility to troubleshoot those things.
Exactly, and that's what we're trying to shoot for. We originally, before we even started this migration process, we discussed just assigning every application a new non-person person right off the bat. And that was the issue we came into is, well, then you can't even try an API ever because nothing's ever gonna work, nothing's ever gonna have rights. And so we kind of settled on your default application will be left with your own personal identity, intended to never be used in production. And then all other applications will be granted a new non-person person right away to just make that process way easier for you. You'll have to request rights for those things that require them, but it'll make it really easy, especially if you already have DSAs. It'll be a click, 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 and we're done kind of thing when we finally get to that point. Any other questions so far on this part of the JWAP?
Come on, Braden.
Yeah.
So you're saying that if I use my default application, it's going to be using user type
The client credentials.
client credentials.
Well, the user type is application.
It will be application
Well, so
on default.
application is a different different issue here, and we're going to get into that in just a second.
Oh, okay.
This client ID is for the non-person person. Application means you use client credentials. There's no resource owner.
Okay.
So we're going to get into now, if there is a resource owner, if there is a user sitting at the keyboard, we tack on a whole ton more information and we change a couple of things. So the user type switches to application user, which means that in this JWAT, you have information about the client and the user who's actually using the application. In OAuth terms, the user sitting at the keyboard is called the resource owner. I know that can be confusing sometimes because in BYU, sometimes we have different things on the resources technically. I didn't make up the word, it's part of the standard. So the resource owner is the user sitting at the keyboard. And then the client is your application that they're using. So whenever there is a resource owner sitting at the keyboard, we switch user type to application user. Client claim source still identifies the same subset of information, whether the application itself is associated to a person or a non-person person. Or essentially the subscriber versus the non-person person. Now you'll also get all these, you'll see right here in the middle, we've got a whole ton of resource owner claims. All of those resource owner claims are the information of the user sitting at the keyboard, not the application. So this, again, will be person ID, net ID, BYU ID, all of their names, so that you have the ability to authorize anything about them. Questions about this?
Are you gonna show the reformatted version of this that some of the SDKs and eventually all of the SDKs will produce?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the SDKs, we'll get into the SDKs we produce, but a lot of them provide the same information, they just change the way you can get at it. You don't have to type in the whole claim. We essentially chop
A
off
lot easier to use, like
BYU EDU.
there's a section for BYU specific information, there's a section for WSO2 specific information.
Just use it. Okay, this is what this looks like if you speak OAuth and you know how client flows work. All of the other flows create this kind of JWAT. So authorization code, implicit, resource owner credentials. All of those flows produce this kind of a JWAT to the back end. Because those all involve a resource owner. And then again, we can also have same exact thing, resource owner, we're using application user, user type, but we switch to client claim source, client ID, meaning the client is associated to a non-person person. Client has its own identity. And you know that's kind of confusing sometimes. Don't get hung up on it because it's really extra superfluous information we're throwing there. I'm willing to bet that none of you in this room will utilize that. It's just very rare that you actually care what kind of identity is associated with the application. You just care who the application is. And so you're free to just not even care where that information came from.
But if you do care.
But if you do care, it's there, exactly. So don't get hung up on it if it doesn't make sense in your use case, but it's there if you need it. So there are a couple of steps involved with this JWAD. Because it's secure, because it's signed, there's a couple steps we want you to go through to validate that the JWAD is actually pure and whole in the way it's supposed to be. There's a couple of steps. There is what's called an ISS claim, pronounced issuer. And you need to check that is what you expect it to be, which for our cases, we expect it to be https://api.wy.edu. That is who we expect to have issued the token we're receiving. You also need to validate that the token hasn't expired using the expired claim. I know they're weird 3-letter abbreviations, part of the JWAD standard. I didn't make those horrible abbreviations. The EXP claim gives you a timestamp in seconds. And so you just validate that that timestamp has not already passed. By default, when we generate a JWAD to go to the backend, it's valid for 15 minutes, which is more than enough time. Your backend should never be getting an invalid JWAD or an expired JWAD. So that is definitely something to watch for when you're getting expired JWADs. It's probably because someone's captured one and is trying to continue to use it. That's kind of what keeps us safe from someone just grabbing the whole JWAD in the hole. And then we validate the signature of the JWAD. Involved in that, we've kind of tacked on another standard to the JWAD. The JWAD standard involves how to validate your JWAD. And in our case, we're using RSA with an HMAC 256. And so we use public-private key asymmetric encryption. And so because of that, there is no standard to how you're supposed to get that public key. So for that, we utilize the OpenID Connect standard. It has a couple of well-known URLs. We'll dig into that in a second. But essentially, they're well-known URLs on the api.byu.edu domain that allow you to go and grab the public key with proper caching headers and things like that. So you know where to go get it, and you're able to cache that public key for a given amount of time. So because the JWAD isn't necessarily trivial to validate, there's a million JWAD libraries out there, but some of them only validate the signature. Some of them do validate issuer and expired. Some of them only validate one or the other. It kind of just depends on the library of what things they force or don't force. And so because of that, as well as tacking on the OpenID Connect standard, we in OIT have produced BYU-specific JWAD SDKs. They're essentially wrappers for the underlying libraries. They're really minimal code-wise. We're utilizing existing JWAD libraries and existing OpenID Connect libraries where they existed. And essentially trying to piece it all together. The benefit of that, or the goal of that, was trying to make your lives easy and trying to produce a simplified API where you could just hand it to JWAD, we validate, grab the public key, deal with caching for you, deal with all of those best practices around making sure the expiry is actually checked, the issuers who we expected it to be. And then on top of that, like Paul mentioned earlier, spitting you back an object that is much easier to parse through. You don't need to tack on the whole byu.edu/w2/claims. You don't have to tack on all that extra information. We try to make it much easier for you to access. So yeah, the benefits of that, we follow best practices in caching and validation so that you don't have to worry about that in your own application. And tie together those standards so that you don't have to worry about using this library and then how does this standard work and try to get them to work together. We've done that for you. And maybe unlike other things you've dealt with in the past, we do plan on maintaining these and keeping them up to date, making sure that we're you're using something that is current for our standards as well as JWAT standards. We've currently produced the SDKs in Python, Node.js, Java, and PHP. PHP is in production
Which
now.
means not
Not
in
yet.
production yet, but we have it scheduled to finish it on the 14th.
Yes, PHP is still in progress. The other three are at least in a V1. The Java one is kind of going through a little bit of reform. We've decided to do it a little differently. But they are all available. They're all in GitHub. I'll show you where you can get at them on the developer portal as well. We're happy to accept pull requests and things like that. But we want to just make your life as easy as possible in all of the languages that we tend to support. If you have an SDK that we don't have that you would like, there's another language you'd like it to be done in, another framework, talk to us, let us know. And if it's something that we utilize and we can help with, we're happy to. For example, with Java, we are kind of producing 2 or 3 Java SDKs. One that's just a flat Java if you just want to use it by hand, one that hooks into Spring security, because we use a lot of that inside of OIT, as well as one to deal with Spark and its filters. And so we're kind of trying to hook into as many the frameworks that we use and see most often to even make it easier for you. One other thing to keep in mind as we go through this progress is, as producers, there's a lot of your APIs that produce events. I know not all of them do, but there's a lot of services out there that produce events through the Event Hub. Most all of the events we produce through the Event Hub have what's called a callback URL. Because our events are public, we don't ever want everyone to see everyone's private information. We usually send out an event saying, break and change something, but if you actually want to see it, call this URL, you'll need authorization. As producers, as you migrate to WSO2, it's easy to forget that your callback URLs might still be your old SOA soft URLs, because your backend will work just fine if you're spitting out bad callback URLs. But you'll break all of your consumers once we shut off SOA. So just make sure and keep in mind as you migrate your consumers or you migrate your producers, if you are producing events, you need to make sure to update those URLs into a new, whatever your new URL is, wherever your new API endpoint is through WSO2. So kind of to sum it all up real quick, there's a couple of basic things that need to be done for your producer to be able to accept calls through WSO2. You need to change the validation of the call from validating the principal ID, the OCT, or all of those headers, into being able to validate the JWAT. And then alongside of that, changing how you're authorizing from using the principal ID or whatever other header you were using into pulling that data out of the JWAT itself. Update your event callback URLs, and then any API consumption that your backend does. So if your backend gets a call and then goes out and calls another API, you'll need to migrate that consumption, obviously. And we've got the consumer training for that, but today we're kind of going over a little bit of both, so if you have questions about that, feel free to ask. But there's really very basic things that need to be done to migrate your producers. Now, we've also recently decided that we are going to allow all of the C framework and all the old legacy code that we have, we've essentially shimmed behind WSO2. WSO2 mediates the sequence and translates the JWAT into the C framework headers that we've always used. It made it so that we didn't have to rewrite millions and millions and millions of lines of code to actually migrate to WSO2. For the time being, from now until the migration is complete, we will let you put that mediation service in front of your backend as well. If it will help you migrate quicker, it will help you get off of what you're currently dealing with SOA, we'll help you stick that mediation sequence in so that your backend will continue to see principal ID, actor, and all of that the way it's recognized it as well. When we do that, you still see the JWAT. And so it does allow you to kind of slowly migrate from using those C framework headers into using the JWAT, because we don't prevent you from seeing that. It's just kind of an additive mediation sequence. And so that's a very easy way for you to get migrated and get your backends off of SOA even faster. Because then at that point, all you're having to deal with is changing some URLs, and essentially you'll be authorizing through the same things you always have. But we don't want that to be a long-term solution. When we do that, we do want an eventual move to the JWAT, as we will be phasing out those headers eventually. Questions about what needs to be done to migrate producers? It really is, we're going to dig into the code in just a second, that Eric has done, and then we'll dig into a little bit of the front end that Scott has done. Really migrating backends is not a ton of effort. It's, especially with our SDKs, we've migrated a couple of node services, for example, and I think for Timekeeper, we changed probably less than 20 lines of code to be able to change from utilizing that principal ID to validating the JWAT and then taking the net ID out of the JWAT and shoving that in what we had always been using. It depends on how your code is written. If you're authorizing in 100 places instead of one centralized place, that obviously becomes a lot harder. But if you've got one central place, authorizes everything and pulls the information you're going to need for the rest of the flow, it's a super easy transition to the JWAT. And it'll make your lives way easier. One of the beautiful things about WSO2 as well is that you migrating to the JWAT does not prevent your backend users from being able to utilize actors and things like that as well. All of that will continue to work, and we've kind of worked through that in some cases. We're trying to make your migration as producers and your customers' migration as consumers as separated as possible, so you can kind of both move as quick as you possibly can without having to trip over each other. So let's go ahead and actually dig in to the code. So I will before I let Eric go, all of this stuff that we've gone over, if you have questions about it, the developer portal is a fantastic resource. We've tried to put all the documentation we possibly could here, and this is going to be and is today our source of truth for WSO2 and our entire API infrastructure's documentation. Everything is going to be here. When we make changes, when we make announcements, it'll all happen here. As well as if you do want to look at like the SDKs that we've produced. That is all. I don't know if it's actually going to the right site, but we've produced all of those here. There's links to all of them here, as well as status. We've also got a .NET SDK planned that we don't currently have anyone working on because there's very few of us who want to deal with .NET. So, or know .NET at all, but we'll say deal with. Anyway, so all of that is here. Please utilize this. It's a great resource. And it should hopefully answer most of the questions you have. If you don't find your answer here, feel free to ask it on ask.byu.edu. We're utilizing that. The web community across campus has utilized that for a number of years. It's not super active at this point in time, but we've decided that's the best place for us to answer questions for both producers and consumers, because it helps me not answer the same question 500 times in a day, which happens currently. And so if you can ask your question there and we can answer it there, we are monitoring it. We are making sure that the right team gets on that as fast as possible. But then we've got a documented answer for what your question was, what the answer was, all of those upvotes and things like that. And it helps us provide a repository for essentially quick, easy questions or FAQ type stuff in the future, so that you don't always have to come ask us and can hopefully find the answer to your questions more quickly. So now we will switch over to Eric. You can go ahead and drive your code.
Yeah.
He'll show us what he changed.
All right. So actually, the first thing I know, we're recording, right? This is
Yes.
okay. I feel bad, but I'm a visual guy, and if it's okay if I draw something on the whiteboard, I'll try to also vocalize it so that it's on here. But I wanted to give you a quick overview of what the applications we're looking at. So the application is student voting. It has a front end and it has a back end. That's the basics. We're going to be looking specifically at the back end and how it's now handling the WSO2 stuff. Because previously, our connection between these was SOA, right? This should look like a lot of the architectures we have out there already. It's a front end going through SOA, back end has some sort of entry point that is resolving like an SM user or a principal ID, something that SOA was providing. So the big difference here is that we're just changing this link. WSO2 is now going to be the in-between because obviously the security, and we're going to have something in between WSO2 in the back and some entry point that will now validate a JWAT and grab the identity from there. The back end, and if I'm wrong on anything, feel free to call me out on it. The back end we're using, it's Spring Framework, and we're using Maven as our deployment environment. So you'll see that most of the changes are just configuration. There's not a lot of Java code that's actually going to change. It's mostly going to be the stuff in the XML Spring in our pull requests. I think that is about it. So if you don't mind, I'm going to pull up that pull request in application that we have been using for pull requests, which makes things really easy. Should I use an incognito window?
You can sign in with mine. If you'll see the same stuff, it's fine.
I don't think I will.
Okay, you can do it incognito.
Okay.
Are you sharing the whole window?
Mhm.
You mean the whole desktop?
Yeah.
And
because
then-
it's all going to the web browser and all that back and forth.
Oh, now how am I going to log in? This is going to be interesting. We'll see if I can get this. Yeah, I know. I'm going to have to go check out my password for GitHub. This
That
is
is a downside.
this is gonna be good, guys.
Someone on someone else's computer, I'm like,
What was that random?
Now's the time to
my wife all the time will be like, "What's your password to this?" And I'm like, "I don't know."
Capital
How do you
J
not know? And I'm
lowercase
like-
d
and then I'm like,
61
you know, show her, and she's like,
underscore websites in my,
Yeah.
command shift L.
Command to bell, yeah. There have been a couple where like I would like have to text it, turn like, "Okay, I'll change this after you're done," and she's like,
Whew, we got it, guys.
"Yeah." I'm like,
We're
"Yeah,
halfway there.
sorry.
And then GitHub.
I don't type it, but you have to.
All right, guys, we're in. Take the time to grab your snacks. And so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with GitHub pull requests, but all this is reviewable as a front for GitHub. It will just display it in a side-by-side, show you everything that's been removed, everything that's been added, and it makes it look kind of nice. So these were all the files changed, but this included also some cleanup and stuff. So all the ones that are already marked as green, we're not going to look at today. There were things that just like test cases getting cleaned up as we did it. Changing our versioning. And so the red ones, as you can see, there's only really 6 files we had to change in order to implement this shift from SOA to WSO2. The big ones, as you can see, there's a couple of POM files, which if you're familiar with Maven is basically the way you define how your application's running. You give it your dependencies, stuff like that. So that will change. There's one Java file there, the third one. I'll wiggle the mouse over it. The base endpoint, that for us. It was whenever you get a request, how are you going to parse out who's making the request and what they want to do. And then as you can see, everything else is XML files. There's a there's a property-based context, a voting context, and a voting security context. So that's what we're going to go over. Most of the changes are right there in that last one, that voting security context. But we'll just loop through them in this order right here and tackle them as we go. So very first thing was in the parent POM. You can see a couple of the changes we had to make were like this top one. You can see red was deleted and then green over here was added. Can you guys see the green? It almost a little light to me. Hopefully you can. But so you can see all we really had to do here was we changed a dependency that we used to have, which was this WS client. It used to be handling some of the credentials using SOA. And we added this WSO2 Spring, which is one of the libraries. Is that part of the get the SDKs that you're talking about, or is that a wrapper for Spring specifically?
That's what the wrappers we're writing.
Okay, so that's
one of the ones that we are currently writing to try and help make it a lot easier to do this migration.
yeah.
For when you use Spring.
And so that code we'll specifically take the JWAT, do the parsing, and then utilize Spring to inject in who's making the request and stuff like that. So that was all our changes in that file. This one in the REST module, so this is the one that handles all of the calls. Once again, we just removed the credential client because we didn't need him anymore, and we added the WSO2 Spring dependency, and then also a Spring integration dependency, which we'll see. And then finally, here's our one Java class that we get to look at. So this is the difference in before it was getting the identity from the SM user, principal ID, that kind of stuff, and now we'll be getting it from the JWAT. And so as you can see, the only important parts are these three functions. So get person ID, get person name, and get logged in user were the three ways that we are identifying the person that was making the request before. And so as you can see on the left, before we were using a user identity object, which was once again part of a library that we had written that parsed it out of an SM user header. And we would gather the person's ID out of the core identity, which is something that was specific to that library. So all that had to change there was now we have a CAS user is what we called the new object. And from that CAS user, you can grab out, and it will grab out of that JWAT the identity of the person logged in, and we can get their ID from there. Same with person name, exact same thing. We're just grabbing the sort name instead of the person ID. And then getting the logged in user, both of these functions are calling get logged in user. So this is the one place we are going to the security context holder. So this is how we'll see later on that we'll have a filter in Spring that will be taking the request. It will parse the JWAT and put whoever's logged in, some CAS user, into the Spring context holder. That's the way that for many applications they store the user in the session. And so all we do is we get out the authentication there. If it's not null, we cast it out to a CAS user and grab that user. So that's it for the Java code. Hopefully that all of your projects will be a little bit different because you'll be having used different objects for your Spring context holder objects, but it should be pretty simple to just make those quick changes to go from your old way of getting the object to the new way of getting the object. Did you have something, Paul? Question?
Just curious, what version of Java are you using on this?
This one's 1.7, right? Did we upgrade it to 1.7 with the last one?
Voting is 1.7.
Yep.
But the tool we're working with is going to be done in 6. So that way.
For backwards compatibility.
So that we can use it in the other
It's
ones.
Not migrated yet.
So the tool, meaning those Maven dependencies we saw in the first couple files that we're depending on, are going to be compatible with 1.6. This specifically is a 1.7 application, but backwards compatibility is fine. Any other questions up to this point? Okay, so those were some of the easier changes we had, and then the last ones are going to be the configuration changes about how to get Spring to play well with the new request being pulled in. This one is, you probably don't even have this. In our application, we had already been doing all the stuff that WSO2 did for us. So you remember when Braden was presenting that we were getting a sort name, we were getting the person ID, net ID, all that stuff. Before, we'd only have an SM user. And so we used to have our own client that would go and get all their information so that we could display their name in the database logs, so that we could tack on a person ID, stuff like that. And so we don't need that anymore. So as you can see, it's commented out here. We had an identity client. And then we also had a member of client because we were checking grow roles. And we don't need to do that anymore because part of his library already has the grow roles. Kind of.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to expand on that at all?
It's in the security.
Okay.
context one, not in this one.
And then finally, we had a client, this credit hours client, because part of student voting is people are only eligible to vote if they're taking a certain number of credit hours. And so that meant that our service, already a backend here, also had to be calling out to some other backend, which would tell us how many credit hours they're enrolled in for the current semester, right? And so before that was being done, as you can see here with the voting API key client, So we would generate an API key for a super user that we had stored the credentials on the server and went out and hit it with our nonce. That could go away now, and all we had to change was to instead give our client, we changed it so that it would now be able to generate an OAuth token, and we just now have to give it the provider to get that token. So that's all from,
That's in the Spring Security.
yes, which is not this next one, but the last one. The voting context, this is all deletions. So these are all of the API key stuff we used to have. So yeah, as you can see here, we had a file stored in a destination that we had designated on some server that is now going away. And then we would be able to use the credentials that were on that server to generate the nonce. We don't need that anymore, gratefully, because now we have these applications that have their client IDs, shared secrets that we can put into a properties file, and everything plays nicely. So now we don't have to store anything on the server anymore. So that's what all those deletions are. And then lastly, here's our last file, the security context. And this is probably the most important one. So to understand what the security context is doing, it includes all of the filters necessary so that when a request comes in, it knows how to handle, like, what permissions do you need for this request? Or when I get a request, should I execute any code before I even send it into the controller that's waiting for it? And so those are the things that changed in these lines here. And so you can look through these yourself as well. A lot of them are specific to our application, such as right here, we say that if somebody's trying to hit votes on a Git, they have to be an admin. And so that's where the grow rules come in. Is that what you're thinking about, Scout, when you're talking about the grow rules?
There's still a member of client down there, but.
Yep, it's not application specific. It's just used by your stuff, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can see that now the big thing that changed was this custom filter. So can you guys even see the mouse? Okay, good. So right up here, there used to be a custom filter that would happen. So it's basically whenever I get a request, you need to execute some code during this time in the cycle. So it used to be this request header authentication filter, which would take in the SM user and would determine who the identity was that was calling and stick that into that Spring context holder that we saw before. That has now gone away. And right here we have its replacement, which is a new custom filter, but the ref, as you can see, is changed to a JWAT filter rather than the request header authentication filter. So the only difference there is instead of calling this line, this class and its code, we're going to be calling the JWAT filter, which is defined below. So we'll look at that right now. So scrolling down, we'll
Just an FYI, for someone who didn't want to make a ton of changes, especially with JWAT specific changes on an existing system, like Greg mentioned before, you could just have your clients call you with client credentials, add an active query, CTP header, and then you can still use the C framework headers that you use.
Yep.
Just FYI.
SM user stuff like that.
But this is actually, migrating more to standard.
Yeah.
This is the full migration.
Full migration.
Yep. So as we see down here below, we'll see some similarities of things moving, such as groups to check. This is the grow thing. So this is the grow admin group. If you're part of that, you can delete elections, you can delete votes, you can see votes. That just moved up to the top. That wasn't actually a deletion, but that's the way it tracked it. So the only real things that we're seeing here that are different is here's the provider and the authenticator that we saw up above. So the authenticator uses the provider, and it was all hooking into our own member of client, identity client, the things that we deleted before. So we don't need those now. And then you'll see on the right-hand side where I so conveniently right-clicked, you'll see all that changed for the JWAT stuff is beneath that comment up there. So these are the beans that were needed in order to replace the old SM user authenticator. That now we have the JWAT filter, which you inject in a couple things, such as the authentication managers, directly below with a reference to a JWAT provider, which is directly below. And you can see it's just a cascading effect of things that Spring needs, and as well as some of the libraries. But all of these dependencies are coming out of that EDU BYU JWAT Spring that we imported in with Maven. Scott
So
wrote.
just a note, this stuff that we're using in this application was a library that I built like almost a year ago to do some of the JWAT stuff. So this doesn't have the newer JWAT SDK or some of the other stuff that we recently built. So we're in the process of trying to move some of this over and make it more up to date. But this was kind of one of my first iterations of trying to do it. So that's probably why it's a little bit more messy, or yeah. So it's still in progress how we're building it, but this is kind of the idea: is you'd have the filter that would you would parse the JWAT, and then using the filter, or somewhere inside the filter in the authentication manager, is where it then tells the user details service, okay, now that you have a JWAT, now create the user details object in your security context holder. So some of that stuff might change, but that's the basic idea. Is you have the filter that grabs the JWAT, authentication manager validates the JWAT, and then inserts that user into the security context holder. That makes sense?
The only difficulty in understanding it is Spring itself. So
Yes. Yeah.
There's
There's a lot of Springisms. But as you can see, most of the context up here, aside from the cascading JWAT filter, it has an authentication manager, which is defined here. The only other stuff is right here, there's an OpenID Connect Discovery URL that you can put in, which, as Braden was mentioning, we use the OpenID well-known stuff in order to validate the signing of the JWAT. So we just made it so that you can change that if that ever does change. It's pretty standard though. And so I don't know if we're gonna make that a default at some point for this library, but that's something that you can inject in here if it ever were to change. As well here, the member of client that we deleted previously, we've now just inserted in here, because now it's using WSO2 as well. Sort of like right here, our backend's going to another backend to check row roles. And so all we put in was what groups do we need to check, which we're defined up at the top there, just checking for student voting admin still. And then in here, you can see in order to make this call, we have to designate the application that's attached to this backend. And so right here in our properties, we have a client ID and a client secret so that we can use client credentials to go hit that other backend. I think that's the gist of it. Did I miss anything? Is there anything here that people still have questions about? Because this is the bulk of the changes, is just in whatever filters you're using when you first get the request. Okay, there's no questions. I think.
Our apps are so much different. It's hard to, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, but the good thing is the location of the changes should be pretty similar. It will mostly be right at that injection point. Whenever you're generating your Spring user, whatever you're using and putting in your context, you'll just have to change that part. If you've written it in such a way that it's centralized. If you just validate it once, it should just go in that first spot.
I think we use some BYU library.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to help build the library-ish that would kind of do the same thing, but JWAT. Oh, we are, sorry.
Okay, if there are no other questions, Scott, did you have stuff that you wanted to add from your front-end development?
Or are we doing the front end separately?
For this, we were gonna kind of do a little bit of both. weren't we?
Yeah, we're gonna do both. We got time.
And I will exit out of that guy.
So yeah, the back end is mainly dealing with JWATs, right? The front end dealt a lot more with the actual bearer tokens, because we're trying to then call these back-end services. Unfortunately, I did not get student voting front end to work the way I wanted it to work, but I can show you the infrastructure code that I'm building. That I already have a sample auth code
module that kind of shows how you can implement, for instance, authentication code. Authorization code. I get those two words mixed up all the time. Authorization code, grant type, and I also have the client credentials grant type as samples. So these are both using just a Spring Web MVC. So kind of a simple Spring Web MVC application. And I mainly did it because Spring seems to be kind of a beast to work with. But I tried to make this this repository as robust as possible, so that way we could even use it in Spark or any other Java usages as needed. So if you don't need Spring, grab the core module. When you for the dependencies. If you do need Spring, then you'll probably need this module as Eric showed in the voting backend. But basically, let's see. So client credentials is the easiest, right? You basically just have client ID and client secret. Kind of go in here a little bit to how it work. No, that's not what I wanted. So this is kind of similar to the security context. There's just a Spring context file. And all I have in here is my token header provider, which basically is a simple thing that says, okay, give me the bearer token header that I need to put in my authentication header. So when you create a request, you always need, with going through WSO2, you need to add an authentication header. And the authentication header usually says bearer space and then an access token, which is just a jumbled string of letters and numbers. So this token header provider basically does that or it grabs the header for you, so then you can then insert it into your authentication header, however you're doing it, whether you're using URL HTTP connection or a Jersey client or however else you need it. That's kind of how you put it in. That needs a provider, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying a getter and setter for, oh no, sorry, wrong way. The provider is what actually grabs the token from WSO2. So WSO2 has an endpoint. I believe it's api.byu.edu/token. And so you send that URL, your client ID and client secret, and it'll give you back the access token. Right, this is for client credentials grant type. So this provider, that's what that does. And so the token header provider needs that, and yeah. And all I have here is just an echo client, which is pretty much using the WSO2 echo API that I think Braden wrote. And so that way is an easy way to take a look at it. But if you want to just quickly look in here, all I'm doing is I need the provider, the token header provider, creating a URL connection, setting the URL to the echo URL. I don't know where I put it, but basically in here, I'm setting the authorization header to what the token header provider is returning back. And that's all I had to do. And I was able to then call that WSO2 endpoint with client credentials. So client credentials is really simple. And hopefully with this sample module, you can kind of see very simply, it's just a few lines of code to do Spring MVC with client credentials. To do auth code is a little bit more intensive. Basically, auth code or authorization code requires the logged in or the person at the keyboard. They have to pretty much authorize your application to then access your data.
So whenever you go to, I don't know, some website that says, hey, Facebook wants to access to your data, this, and this, and you say, yeah, go ahead, that's authorization code. And so that's where we're kind of doing the same thing here. And because of that, because it requires, in many cases, it requires user interaction. There's actually kind of a crazy OAuth dance. It has to kind of go back and forth between a few different places. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult. You can't just say, okay, here's client, here's my client ID and client secret and give me the access token. We have to do a little bit more than that. And so authorization code, you still have to give it the client ID and client secret. But here, basically how we implement, is we have, I've created kind of a auth code dance filter, is what I call it, because it really is just kind of the dance. And kind of like what we saw on Eric's code, there was a custom filter that parsed the JWT and stuff. Here's a custom filter that will listen to every request coming into your Spring web app. And then it says, okay, do I have a token? Do I have a valid access token? If I don't, I'm redirecting you to the authorized endpoint. And the authorized endpoint from WSO2 then returns back to your callback endpoint or your redirect endpoint. It returns an authorization code. That is not the same thing as an access token. The authorization code then is used to get your access token. So you got, you go out to WSO2 from the authorized, that comes back to your callback URL with a code. Your code then goes back to WSO2 to get a token, and then that comes back with your token. So that's the auth dance, the auth code dance. And what this filter does is it listens for both. It listens to see, okay, I don't have an access token, go get an auth code. And then it goes there, and then it's again listening for that callback URL, or the redirect URL. And then once it grabs that code, it then goes out to the /token endpoint, grabs the access token, brings it back, stores it in the security context holder, and then it redirects to the originally requested URL. So hopefully that's the main thing that all you need to do if you want to do auth code in your front end, is to put the filter, and that should do most of the work. And then you just need to make sure that your user details object pretty much implements this kind of, just kind of make sure that they, yes. Okay, so yeah, this just specifies that we're storing the access token in the Spring security context, which then means you need to implement make sure that your user details, whatever it is also able to store the access token. So that's why I have an interface for that. Then you need the provider, which is kind of like the client credentials provider, which, okay, you just pretty much give the provider, here's an auth code, go get me an access token, and it'll get you the access token. And then you can give it a refresh token, and that'll get you back an access token. So that's another difference with authorization code grant type than client credentials, is that authorization code grant type access tokens also give you a refresh token, which lasts much longer than the 15 minutes or however long your first access token is valid for. The refresh token, so basically if your access token expires, then you use your refresh token and it'll give you another access token without having to do that whole auth code dance again. So that's kind of the point of that. This was just a plain poacher that holds the client ID and client secret. So I don't know. Is that making any sense? Show the code. Yes. So the main thing here is in the security context again. Here we have
a security where you can intercept URLs and have different authentication on it. Custom filter. Well, here I'm actually going through CAS. Even though we can use WSO2 to do the authentication for us. In this case, I'm just doing CAS because a lot of our applications already are going through CAS. But basically right here, here's the auth code filter. This is going after all the other filters Spring security filters have gone through. Let's see, and here's the implementation of that filter. So the filter, we give it the credentials. I've made it where you can ignore certain paths if you want to. And the holder and the provider. So again, this holder just says, hey, we're storing the authors, all these access tokens in Spring Security, Spring Security context. The provider, again, is the thing that actually gets the access tokens. But the filter is what then grabs that information and stores it. Yeah, it does all that fun stuff. And then again, I have an Echo client, so kind of the same, almost the same kind of thing. And you give it the token header provider again, and that provider has both the token holder and token provider. So yeah, I wish I could kind of like actually show this in action, because it's a little bit more spiffy than just kind of looking at the code.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, show it in action, can't you?
Well, I'd have
It's on
to.
his machine.
It's on your local host.
Yeah, it's on my machine, or you'd have to spin up a Tomcat or some other web server on here. Because again, this is a front end, yes, but it is using a server. So it's kind of like a back end, but it is a front end. So it's serving up our JSPs as the yeah. So here again is the client, almost identical. I'm just using a token header provider again, and connection, HTTP URL connection, adding the authorization header, and so that provider then checks to see if the access token is still valid. If it's not, it's going to use the refresh token to get a new one, and then return the valid one. So that way, in my client, I only had to change one line of code, and so that's pretty nice. And we are in the process of then also creating filters for other ways of calling REST endpoints with Java. So for instance, there's a Jersey client, and you can just give it filters. And so every time you use that Jersey client to make a call, the filter will go through and add the header for you. And so there's going to be some more on that way. Does any of this make sense, or is this just kind of crazy?
It's just, it's,
Yeah,
that makes me gloss over. But besides that,
yeah. So hopefully, again, this is way under construction still, but we are making some good headway. Hopefully this repo will have enough tools to help make your lives easier with transitioning over from SOA to WSO2. So again, right now most of this is basically kind of the front end stuff, calling back-end services, but soon we'll all pretty much tie in our BYU, JWA SDK, and some of the other stuff, so then we can also have more of the back-end listening all in one place. You can just depend on one or two different modules, and that's all you need instead of having to go to 3 or 4.
if someone is working on migrating a Java web service or a Java front end like this, and they would like to use this infrastructure, but since it's not fully fleshed out and documented yet, should they just contact you directly?
Yeah.
And that's Scott Hutchins, everyone.
Yep, I'm more than happy to help, because this is really kind of confusing. It's taken me almost a whole year to kind of understand what this is, and I still don't understand it enough. So
Yeah.
if I can save somebody a couple months of heartache or headache, I will do my best.
And again, you have the other option if you're in a Java system and you just want to replace a nonce API key call to use client credentials in the acting for header,
Yes.
which is basically, not exactly, but basically a one-to-one switch.
Yeah.
You could use this code or you could write your own. You just basically, instead of the nonce, instead of putting that actor at the last path parameter to your nonce request call, you instead get a token, and then when you make your actual call, use the authorization, bearer, and an acting for header with the actor. That's it.
Yeah, and I might even add kind of similar thing here as well. Put the acting for if you want to optionally.
Yeah.
So trying to make it as easy as possible. If you don't use it, I'm not offended. So, any questions? Okay.
You got a question?
Yes.
Just, yeah, wondering about the acting for header.
So
That is a stopgap, right? That will go away eventually, and you'll want to do the.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so we're talking go away is probably years, just because on the code we're working on today, we want it gone fairly quickly. But on the C framework code, I mean, we're going to be years migrating some of that old legacy code, and so is definitely not going to go away from any of those systems anytime soon.
Before that goes away, you'll be alerted that we are rewriting that system, and so we'll be using the newer OAuth standard ways to call it, and then you'll be given a time to migrate. So
Exactly. What the preliminary discussions we've been having, because
plus we'll know who's calling it, right? So
exactly. We've kind of been up until now just kind of putting out fires as quick as possible, so we haven't quite dug into exactly how we're going to deal with the migration off of that yet. We're really focused on just getting people off SOA right now, but it'll probably end up being a service by service basis. Once the migration is complete, we'll kind of let the development teams decide when they want to migrate, and then it'll be up to them to communicate with you as a consumer and say, we're getting rid of this, and work with you, because we'll kind of let that be a one by one as we start piecing things out and updating things. We will, however, in the discussions we've had thus far, once we're post-migration, no new services will support that. We're only doing it as a stopgap for right now for this migration for current existing services, but once we pass April 30th, we'll be done putting that into any application. Just because we don't want to run ourselves further down the rabbit hole that we're already trying to get up out of. And so we decided we're okay with the migration pattern. But
Unless the new apps have to call.
yeah, if the new apps are consuming old stuff, they just won't allow you to consume them that way. They may have to continue to consume things that way, but the new services that you're consuming won't allow that consumption pattern. And so that's just kind of, Josh looks very confused and upset about that. But that's the route we're going. And we weren't initially, we've already got some services like Y-Message that already weren't going to support the acting for, but we've kind of done a 180 there and said, okay, for now, any services currently being consumed through SOA will allow it up until that migration point, so that we can hurry and get people off and move to WSO2 and make it less painful for the consumers. But yeah, once we've got all of our consumers migrated and all those old services migrated, we're going to force everyone to use the new method, because that's already a hole we're trying to get out of. So, but you don't have to worry about it right now. And we'll, communicate that on a service by service basis. Any other questions? Okay. If you have any other questions, I mean, we're all happy to help, especially as you migrate. If you hit problems, please reach out, because it's very likely that we've hit the problems you're hitting. Especially,
if not, we want to see it.
And if not, we want to see it. But internally to OIT, we've got a lot of migration work under our belts at this point. We've migrated quite a few services in a couple of different languages. And so don't don't fight the battle alone. If you have any service that you're hitting and you can't figure out something, put it in ask, read the developer portal, come ask us. We're happy to help because we've probably seen those same issues, and if not, we want to fix them. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.